The I don't know what you watch late at night, but sometimes it's just whatever on. But they had an interesting thing in there about how people are looking more at scientists are looking more at discovering the intelligence of animals. When we were growing up, we just said it was all instinct. The animals were just born with what to do, which always fascinated me. Like how do the squirrels make those little nests with leaves to keep themselves warm during the winter? I mean, if it was just instinct, you think one squirrel might go up and say, "What are you doing?" He says, "I don't know. It's just a compulsion." Well, they found out though that not only is there greater. This has nothing to do with my homily, by the way. I'm just telling you this. There's nothing to do. That not only is there a greater level of animal intelligence than what we have heretofore thought, but that some animals are much smarter than others, and even within their own species, some stand out. You've heard of things a bit like, cats are smarter than dogs, and horses are smarter than dogs and cats, and well, they found out that pigs were extremely intelligent. Did you know that? And they found even among the studies that they did with the pigs, there was one that really stood out. And they said, this has got to be the smartest pig in the world. Did you see that on NPR? No? Einstein? There's what I was going for. There you go. The great groan. I had to think of something to come up with because Dick Tillman and I were together yesterday for celebrating a mass, and somebody who was there at the family thanked him and said they also said even for his bad jokes, and it reminded me. I said, well, I should come up with one of those once in a while. Einstein. Somebody just told me that yesterday too. I thought it was perfect. Well, do you remember? Here we are on the Feast of Christ the King, and it is the very last Sunday of the liturgical year. Next Sunday begins the new liturgical calendar with Advent, in which we prepare not just for Christmas, although obviously Advent is 4 weeks before Christmas, but we acknowledge the fact that, Christ is born, Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. So we pay particular attention to the gift of the incarnation, the coming of Christ at Christmas. But that's already happened. And so while we remember it each year, we pledge to remember it as part of the big picture. Why did Jesus come? Jesus came to give us the gift of eternal life. Is this world the only life? No. This is just a pilgrimage to the Father, for the kingdom that is yet to come, but which has already been started because of the entry of the Son of God, the Word made flesh, into our life. And so this feast, Christ the King, coming at the end of the church's calendar year, reminds us that there is one who is master over us, and we are servants. There is one who is teacher, and we are students. There is one who is the rabbi, and we are disciples. And so that's very important, because our culture tends to celebrate, very much so, I think, an independent person, a person who is independent. We like to celebrate self-made men and women. We like to think that we have a tremendous amount of freedom to determine what the outcome of our own lives will be. And yet, as we get into Advent and the apocalyptic imagery about, judgment, you'll see it in different ways with different examples. And it always has to do with somebody who's under somebody else who needs to be prepared, because the person that they are supposed to be serving might show up at the last minute. And so they should make sure that they are, doing what needs to be done in order to fulfill their obligation as the servant. So you have, for instance, the parable of the bridesmaids, the ones that were wise and the ones that were foolish, because the bridegroom delayed his coming, and the ones who were supposed to go out to greet him with oil in their lamps, they didn't bring any extra oil, and their lights were going out. Remember that one? There was also the one about the master goes away on a long trip, and the servant does not know when his master will return, but that he should be prepared, so that even if he comes at an unexpected time, he won't find the servant, just snoozing and, eating potato chips in front of the TV. But well, that wasn't in the Bible, but that the servant would be busy about the master's business. There's also the story about the master that left to go on a business journey, but he left certain investments to be made. The parable of the talents. And there were some that were very industrious, and they made twice as much. And there was one who said, I know you're a hard master, and so I was afraid of you. So what I did, I just buried it, and here it is back. And so with all of those, you have the idea of there is going to come a time for reckoning, a time where someone has to give an account. And that's what we essentially try to remember all the rest of the days of our lives in the church liturgical year. The fact that, we are not the king of our own lives. Sometimes when people say, who made you the boss of me? Little kids will say that, who made you the boss of me? But the reality is all of us have a boss, and it is the Lord, the Almighty. And we can forget that. And what can happen is that in the busyness of life, God gets put further and further back as we are often encumbered with things that other people are telling us we have to do, or things that we know we have to do, just to keep, food and clothing and shelter, going. Takes an awful lot of time and industry. And so the time for God can get pushed off to whenever we have leftover time. It's true, isn't it? And at time for prayer, which should be morning and evening, certainly, but also during the day, that gets pushed off to maybe even just Sunday, as a matter of fact. And it's good that we still have it on Sunday, but we can become less aware of who it is that's supposed to be guiding our life and who it is that we owe our whole life to. And that's where Christ the King Sunday comes in, to remind us that there is a Lord, one. And it keeps us from being able to be distracted by either having to serve other bosses or trying to serve other gods, power, wealth, fame, whatever. Now this is something that was written by an Episcopalian preacher, Greg Garrett. It says he's a novelist, a professor of English at Baylor University. And lots of times when we talk about judgment, being judged, or that we have to give an account of our life here on earth, our life in the body, as St. Paul says, we kind of put it into, at least I do anyway, a single question, which is sort of like, will I get into heaven? Will I get into heaven? Will I be saved? And that really doesn't necessarily do a lot for directing our life, unless we allow God to have some say in how we live. Otherwise, we sort of wind up existing in the framework as most children do when Christmas comes, where the month before Christmas, you're real good, right? The month before Christmas, you're real good because Christmas is coming, but the rest of the time, it's too far away to worry about. And so in lots of our lives, our mortality is too far away for us to worry about it. We'll get to that time when it comes. And yet, judgment is not going to be just do we get into heaven. It is, were we faithful as God's servants? Were we obedient to the Lord of life, the King of Kings? Did we put God first in our life and everything else second? Or is God somewhat further down the list of all the things that we have on our to-do list? And so here's what he said. It was so succinct. I don't generally read stuff, but I thought this was put well. It says, if you think the question is, am I going to heaven? Will I be saved? And of course, what sometimes is read on this Sunday is the judgment scene in Matthew, where God, the King, comes in glory with the thrones and powers and dominions of heaven, and he separates the good from the evil, like a shepherd separates sheep from goats, And to the sheep, he will say, well done, good and faithful servants. I was hungry, you gave me to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me to drink. You remember that. And they'll say, when did we see you and do this? Feed you, clothe you, take you in when you were homeless, visit you when you were sick or in prison. When did we see you? And he says, if you did it for the least of my sisters or brothers, you did it for me. And then when he condemns those who didn't do it, they go, hey, wait a minute. We never saw you in this situation. Had we seen you in this situation, we might have done something about it. Don't blame us. And he's going to say, amen, amen. I say to you, evildoers, depart from me, because I was hungry. It said, if you didn't do it for the least of my sisters or brothers, you didn't do it for me. So go to hell. That's sort of the whole idea behind that story. If you neglected to do it, you neglected to do it for me. And that is something, too, that we don't think about a lot. It has to do with sins of omission. We all know sins of commission, things that we've done that we shouldn't have done. And as you get older, sometimes it's harder and harder to get out from under that, because as you tend to grow older, you tend to grow a little wiser and less self-centered. And then you begin to see, partly because you are older and know better, that some of the mistakes that you made in life, bother you late in life, and you can't go back and change those things. You could change yourself now and avoid certain things that you did, but you can't go back to somebody else that you've harmed and said, I wish I'd never done that. Well, you can say that, but you can't undo the harm that you did. I find that to be a compelling reason for an examination of conscience, to try to help us find a place of peace within our hearts and our lives, so that we aren't just tormented sometimes by the pain that we feel for having hurt others and not being able to reconcile that. So here's what he says. If you think the question is, am I going to heaven? Will I be saved? Am I a sheep or a goat? Maybe you missed the point. The question rightly asked is not what happens at the end of time, but more like, what am I supposed to be doing right now? What does Jesus want me to do, to be? How would my life be different if I acknowledged the lordship of Christ and his kingship over my life? The conflict over who is Lord is acted out in our lives today, even though Rome is long gone. That was a question that Pilate asked Jesus. So you're a king? That was his crime, because if he was a king, then he was in opposition to the emperor, which made him a revolutionary. And Jesus says, well, I'm a king. You say I'm a king, but I'm not a king in the way you think. So say, what does Jesus want me to do? How will my life be different? The conflict over who is Lord is acted out in our lives today, even though the empire of Rome is long gone and Pilate is long gone. The world still wants us to bow down before all that is not God. And our culture rewards us when we do. But this conflict between the two kingdoms, one of this world, one of the divine realm, becomes clearly delineated in the life of Jesus. Jesus tells us and shows us that the usual things people elevate as gods, as desirable goods, temporal power, wealth, celebrity, and fame, are subsumed in the kingdom of God by the supreme and overarching values of service, love, self-sacrifice, and faithful community. Let me say that again. The usual things people elevate as desirable goods, which take hold of their lives, I might add, become seeking out temporal power, wealth, celebrity, fame, security, and these are subsumed in the kingdom of God by the values of service, love, self-sacrifice, and faithful community. Life in God's kingdom is not about self-enrichment. It's about renunciation of the self. It's not about big words. It's about powerful actions. Life in God's kingdom is not about what you have or who you are. It's about what you do. If we indeed are on a conveyor belt going from birth to eternity, the question isn't what will happen when we get there, but what are we doing along the way? Life in God's kingdom is not about what you have or who you are, it's about what you do. And it's not about what the world values, but what God values. Do you remember, it was the 60s or 70s, it was one of the first movies that Michael Caine was in as a young actor. It was called Alfie. And there was a song, I think Burt Bacharach wrote it, and I think Dionne Warwick sang it. But it had some compelling verses in it. It said, if I can remember it, it says, "What's it all about, Alfie?" I'm going to have to sing it to remember it. "What's it all about, Alfie? Is it just for the moment we live? What's it all about when you sort it out, Alfie? Are we meant to get more than we give? Or are we meant to be kind?" Jesus gave us an example of a life that was compassionate and was filled with concern not for self but for other. And that's kind of the simple question. What's it all about? And Feast of Christ the King reminds us that our lives, while we reside in them, do not truly belong to us. They're given to us by God. And when we are finished with our life in the body, we will have to give back to God an acknowledgement for what did we do with the gift that he gave us. We happen to have, just by happenstance today, a relic from one of the newest saints in the church, Bishop Oscar Romero. It's part of one of the vestments that he wore, so it's a second-class relic. But the important thing is the memory of his life. Oscar Romero was a man who was confronted and conflicted by his being put onto the world stage in San Salvador in the midst of terrible oppression of the people and killings and drug wars and injustice. And he was sent there as bishop not because he was a person who was outspoken, but because he was like a diplomat in the church. And so he wouldn't upset anybody. He would be kind of quiet. He was a company man, if you would. And what happened is, when he got there and saw the disparity between the people that had no voice and himself, who was in a position of authority and had a voice, he could no longer keep silent. And even though he struggled with this, because he was essentially a church bureaucrat, he was not an activist. But he realized that he was in the midst of this conflict, and he had to speak out against the injustice and the danger that the people faced. In doing so, he set himself up against the drug lords and against the institutional church, which often sided, with people of wealth rather than the poor. And at that time, the church was also afraid so much of communism and socialism that it was very suspicious of somebody, who would take upon himself to intercede directly in the lives of the poor and to advocate for social justice and for truth. That's one of the reasons why he didn't become a saint for so long, because he was not held in high esteem by authorities in the church. Did you know that? That's true, completely true. And what happened is, he realized as he was coming to speak that he was endangering his own life, but in acknowledging it, he said something on the order of, "I realize that I live as you do under threats to our life." He says, "But I'm not concerned that they may kill me." In fact, I think he said that they will kill me because I am a Christian and I know that I shall not die. And of course, he was killed while saying Mass. So in this Feast of Christ the King, here's somebody who's certainly a reluctant warrior, but stepped up to the plate when he was confronted with his own conscience. And he found himself offering Mass and realizing that he was in a certain place at a certain time and could say nothing or he could act. He decided to act. And for that, he became a saint.